This dog refused to leave the grave. When they dug it up, everyone was stunned. The autumn air in the small town of Meadowbrook was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a quiet place where life moved slowly and everyone knew one another's business. Yet, over the past week, whispers about a strange occurrence in the local cemetery had started to circulate. At the heart of the rumors was a dog, an unassuming Labrador mix with chocolate brown fur, soulful eyes, and a perpetually alert demeanor. Before we continue with the video and dive deeper into the incredible story, I want to ask for your help. I'm aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and your support would mean the world to me. If you've been enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments down below. Locals first noticed the dog, whom no one could identify, lingering near a particular grave in the Meadowbrook cemetery. No matter the time of day or night, the dog was there, lying motionless at the foot of a modest gravestone. He ignored attempts to coax him away, turning his head stubbornly each time someone approached with food or kind words. "Poor thing," murmured Mrs. Ellison, the elderly groundskeeper. "Probably lost his owner." But there was no name or photograph on the gravestone, only a date etched into its weathered surface. July 15th, 1983. It was an unmarked grave, one of many in the older section of the cemetery, a relic from Meadowbrook's less prosperous past. Word of the mysterious dog reached Mark Taylor, a young journalist new to Meadowbrook. Mark had taken the job at the local paper, the Meadowbrook Gazette, hoping to find quiet stories with a touch of human interest. The cemetery dog seemed like the perfect opportunity to start his career with something heartfelt. Armed with a notebook, a camera slung around his neck, and an air of determined curiosity, Mark arrived at the cemetery just before sunset. The evening light cast long shadows over the tombstones, and the autumn chill made the air sharp and biting. As Mark approached the grave, he spotted the dog lying with its head resting on its paws, its eyes alert but calm. It was as though the dog were standing vigil, guarding a secret that no one else could understand. "Hey, boy," Mark called softly, crouching a few feet away. He reached into his bag and pulled out a sandwich, unwrapping it slowly to catch the dog's attention. The dog lifted its head, but didn't move closer, its amber eyes fixed intently on Mark. "You've got everyone talking, you know," Mark continued, his voice low and soothing. "What's so special about this spot?" The dog tilted its head slightly, as if considering Mark's question before resting it back on its paws. Mark decided to leave the sandwich nearby and retreat, hoping the dog would grow accustomed to his presence over time. Intrigued by the mystery, Mark began digging into the history of the cemetery and the unmarked grave. He combed through archives at the town library and interviewed anyone who might remember something about the grave's occupant. The date etched into the stone was his only clue, but it was enough to lead him to a faded ledger listing burial records. The entry for July 15th, 1983 was sparse, unknown individual, found at the edge of town, no identification. The lack of detail frustrated Mark, but it also deepened his resolve. Who was this person? And why was the dog so fixated on their resting place? That night, Mark returned to the cemetery, determined to learn more. He brought a flashlight and a blanket, preparing to stay as long as necessary to observe the dog's behavior. To his surprise, the dog seemed less wary of him this time. It even allowed him to sit a few feet closer, though it kept its eyes on the grave, unmoving. As the hours ticked by, Mark couldn't help but wonder if the dog was guarding the grave or waiting for something or someone. By the third night, Mark was no closer to understanding the dog's connection to the grave, but something changed just after midnight. He was half asleep when the sound of scratching jolted him awake. The dog was digging at the base of the gravestone. "Hey!" Mark whispered sharply, scrambling to his feet. He moved closer, expecting the dog to stop, but it didn't. Its paws worked furiously, kicking up dirt in all directions. The urgency in its movements was startling. Okay, hold on," Mark said, placing a hand on the dog's back to calm it. The dog stopped briefly, panting heavily, then looked at Mark with eyes that seemed to plead for his understanding. "What are you trying to tell me?" Mark murmured, his heart pounding. In that moment, Mark made a decision. He would bring his findings to Mrs. Ellison and the local authorities. Whatever was buried beneath that grave deserved to be uncovered. As dawn broke over Meadowbrook, Mark's determination solidified. He had no idea what lay beneath the unmarked stone, but he knew one thing for sure: the dog wasn't going to leave until the truth was unearthed. The following morning, Mark hurried to the cemetery office, where Mrs. Ellison was sorting through a pile of maintenance records. The elderly groundskeeper looked up from her desk, her brow furrowing at the sight of his disheveled appearance and urgent expression. "Morning, Mark. You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, half joking. "Not quite," Mark replied, catching his breath. "It's about the dog. He started digging at the grave last night. I think there might be something buried there, something important." Mrs. Ellison leaned back in her chair, her expression turning serious. "You really think so?" Mark nodded. "It's not just random behavior. He's been sitting there for days, and now he's digging like he's trying to tell us something." Mrs. Ellison hesitated, her fingers tapping against the desk. "I don't know, Mark. That grave's been undisturbed for decades. But if the dog's right and there's something there, we'd better find out." Together, Mark and Mrs. Ellison approached the local police department to request permission to investigate the grave. Sergeant Claire Davis, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for fairness, listened carefully to their account. She was skeptical at first, but the dog's unusual behavior and the lack of details about the grave intrigued her. "All right," Sergeant Davis finally said, crossing her arms. "We'll take a look, but this has to be done properly. I'll get the paperwork for an exhumation order. In the meantime, keep that dog from digging up half the cemetery." Mark felt a mix of relief and apprehension as they left the station. They were one step closer to uncovering the truth, but the weight of the unknown hung heavily over him. What would they find? The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Mark stayed close to the cemetery, keeping an eye on the dog and documenting its behavior. He nicknamed the dog Rusty, a nod to the reddish undertones in its brown fur. Rusty seemed to grow more restless with each passing day, pacing around the grave and whimpering softly at night. Mrs. Ellison, meanwhile, contacted local historians and archivists, hoping to unearth more details about the unmarked grave. One of them, an elderly man named Frank Harlow, remembered hearing rumors about the grave when he was a boy. They said the person buried there didn't belong, Frank told her. Nobody knew who they were or where they came from. Some folks thought it was bad luck to even talk about it. Mrs. Ellison relayed the information to Mark, who couldn't shake the feeling that Rusty was connected to the grave in a way no one yet understood. On the third morning, the exhumation team arrived at the cemetery, accompanied by Sergeant Davis and a forensic anthropologist, Dr. Elena Morgan. Mark and Mrs. Ellison stood at a respectful distance as the team began their work, Rusty sitting anxiously at Mark's side. The process was methodical and somber. The team carefully removed layers of soil, revealing a simple wooden coffin buried beneath the earth. The wood was weathered but intact, a testament to the craftsmanship of a bygone era. When the coffin was finally lifted out and opened, everyone held their breath. Inside was a set of human remains, partially preserved by the coffin's construction. But what caught everyone's attention was the bundle of cloth nestled beside the bones. Dr. Morgan gently unwrapped it, revealing a small rusted locket and a tattered photograph. The photograph depicted a man and a dog standing in front of a modest farmhouse. The dog bore an uncanny resemblance to Rusty, right down to the reddish undertones in its fur. The discovery sent a ripple of shock through the group. How could Rusty, a living dog, resemble the one in a decades-old photograph? Dr. Morgan examined the locket, finding a faint inscription on the back, "For my loyal friend." Inside was a faded picture of the same dog, alongside a man with kind eyes and a weathered face. Mark's mind raced. This can't be a coincidence. Rusty must be connected to this somehow. Sergeant Davis, ever the pragmatist, chimed in. It's possible Rusty is a descendant of the dog in the photograph. Maybe he was drawn here by scent or instinct. But Mrs. Ellison had another theory, one that sent chills down Mark's spine. What if it's something deeper? Dogs have been known to sense things we can't, memories, emotions. Maybe Rusty is here to honor his ancestors' bond. The group fell silent, each grappling with the implications of the discovery. Rusty, for his part, seemed content now, lying beside the grave as if his mission were complete. In the days that followed, the story of Rusty and the unmarked grave spread throughout Meadowbrook. The photograph and locket were displayed at the local library alongside an exhibit honoring the unknown man and his loyal companion. Mark decided to adopt Rusty, feeling a deep sense of responsibility toward the dog who had brought the past to light. Rusty quickly adapted to his new life, becoming Mark's steadfast companion and the subject of countless heartwarming articles. As for the grave, the town came together to give it a proper marker. The new headstone bore a simple inscription, "In memory of a loyal bond never broken." Mark often visited the cemetery with Rusty, marveling at how a simple dog's devotion had uncovered a forgotten piece of history. And every time they sat by the grave, Rusty would wag his tail, his eyes filled with a quiet satisfaction that spoke volumes. It was a reminder that some connections transcend time, and that even in the quietest corners of the world, extraordinary stories are waiting to be discovered. As the weeks passed, Rusty became a beloved figure in Meadowbrook. The story of the unmarked grave and the mysterious connection between Rusty and the dog in the photograph had captivated the entire town. People came from neighboring areas to see the exhibit at the library and pay their respects at the newly marked grave. One chilly afternoon, Mark and Rusty were sitting by the grave, enjoying the serenity of the cemetery. Rusty seemed unusually calm, lying on the grass with his head resting on his paws. Mark was lost in thought, still trying to make sense of everything. He reached into his bag and pulled out the photograph again. The man in the picture had a rugged yet kind face, and his clothes suggested he had been a farmer or laborer. Mark felt a pang of curiosity. Who was this man? And what had brought him and his dog to Meadowbrook all those years ago? The local historian, Frank Harlow, had been tirelessly working to uncover more about the grave's occupant. One evening, he called Mark to share his findings. "Mark, I think I've got something," Frank said, his voice trembling with excitement. Frank explained that he had found a journal in the town archives belonging to a former Meadowbrook resident named Thomas Darrow. The journal mentioned a man named Elias Green, who had arrived in Meadowbrook during the Great Depression. Elias had been a drifter, moving from town to town in search of work, always accompanied by his loyal dog, Red. According to the journal, Elias had become a beloved figure in Meadowbrook, known for his generosity and his knack for helping others despite his own hardships. He and Red had lived on the outskirts of town, and they often helped struggling families with their farms and homes. But as times grew tougher, Elias fell ill, and the journal abruptly stopped mentioning him. "Mark," Frank continued, "I think Elias is the man in the grave, and Rusty, he's the spitting image of Red." Mark couldn't shake the uncanny feeling that Rusty's presence in the cemetery wasn't random. The dog had arrived with purpose, sitting by the grave as if drawn by an invisible thread of loyalty that spanned generations. To honor Elias and Red, the town decided to hold a memorial service. The service would celebrate not only Elias's contributions to Meadowbrook, but also the bond between him and his dog, a bond that seemed to echo in Rusty. On the day of the memorial, townsfolk gathered at the cemetery. Mrs. Ellison gave a moving speech about Elias's kindness and resilience, while Frank recounted the stories from the journal. Mark, with Rusty by his side, shared how the dog's unwavering determination had led them to uncover this remarkable story. When the ceremony ended, Rusty walked to the grave and lay down beside it, his tail wagging gently. The sight brought tears to many eyes, a poignant reminder of the loyalty and love that had transcended time. Life in Meadowbrook settled into a peaceful rhythm after the memorial. Rusty became a symbol of hope and connection, and people often stopped by the cemetery to visit him and the grave. The town even erected a small statue near the grave, a bronze depiction of Elias and Red standing side by side. Mark and Rusty grew inseparable. Rusty accompanied Mark on his daily rounds, offering comfort to grieving families and bringing joy to the quiet corners of the cemetery. For Mark, Rusty was more than a companion. He was a constant reminder of the profound impact of loyalty and love. One evening, as Mark sat on his porch with Rusty at his feet, he reflected on the journey they had taken together. He thought about how a stray dog had brought a forgotten story to light, reminding everyone in Meadowbrook of the enduring power of bonds forged in trust and care. Mark looked down at Rusty, who was gazing up at him with his soulful eyes. "You've changed everything, you know that?" Mark said, scratching behind Rusty's ears. Rusty let out a contented sigh and rested his head on Mark's knee. It was a quiet moment, but it spoke volumes. a testament to the incredible journey that had begun with a dog sitting by an unmarked grave. In the years that followed, Elias and Red's story became a cherished part of Meadowbrook's history. School children learned about them in class, and visitors to the library often lingered at the exhibit. Rusty lived out his days surrounded by love, his loyalty never wavering. Mark often wondered what had drawn Rusty to the cemetery that day, but he no longer needed answers. Some mysteries, he realized, were best left as they were, beautiful, unexplainable, and timeless. And as the seasons changed and the cemetery bloomed with life, the grave of Elias Green and his dog remained a beacon of hope, watched over by a loyal companion who had brought the past into the present and reminded everyone that love and devotion know no boundaries.